Hello, LAPCS scholars. Mr. Rowley here. So today we're going to be talking about the War of 1812. As you can see, War of 1812. So it's important that you understand you're to do the Cornell notes again. So please make sure you're doing the Cornell note format in order to do these correctly. And don't forget, at the end of this, you have an exit ticket to complete. And make sure you share these things with Ms. Marks and I. So part one of the War of 1812, a balancing act. So the War of 1812 has often been called the Revolutionary War Part Two. And in many ways, it was just that. It was a war between America and Great Britain. It was caused in part by disagreements over shipping and trade on the high seas or on the oceans. It also involved fighting in America and in Canada. It ended in an American victory, at least politically. Overall, however, it was a war to decide how much influence the United States would have on foreign affairs. That is what we're going to be talking about. So here is what happened. President Thomas Jefferson, our third president, was looking to keep American goods flowing overseas and at the same time keep America out of foreign wars. It was a balancing act, and the U.S. was bound to lose its balance sooner or later. Great Britain and France were at war with each other, and that's what this picture illustrates, as was much of the rest of Europe. They were fighting Napoleon, essentially, from France. Both sides thought that American ships were supplying the other with food and weapons. Both British ships and French ships routinely stopped American ships on the high seas and demanded to search the cargo holds. Sometimes those encounters were violent. Just imagine a warship coming up to your boat. How would you react when you're just trying to get goods from one place to another? Part two, trade, shipping, and war. U.S. anger rose to a fever pitch and resulted in the passage of the Embargo Act of 1807. This extremely unpopular act prevented America from selling to foreign ports, not just British or French ports, but any foreign ports all over the world. So how would they make money if you can't sell your goods? Yeah, that was the problem. The Embargo Act was a disaster. Jefferson had thought that Britain and France would be devastated when they didn't receive the regular shipments of food, weapons, and other American goods. Instead, the two warring nations managed to get along just fine without American goods. They just found them in other parts of the world. The Embargo Act backfired, and American ships sat in American ports, and their cargoes were rotting and spoiling. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, was elected president. Remember James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights? He was elected president, but not by a huge margin. Before he left office, Jefferson signed a bill repealing the Embargo Act because it was a disaster. But American ships kept getting searched, and American anger grew. President Madison tried to keep the United States out of the European war, but more poorly American ships and sailors were treated, the more American people wanted war. Part three, the war hawks win. They wanted war with both Britain and France, but the resentment toward Britain was stronger. British ships returned to their policy of impressment, and this picture illustrates what that is. Basically, sailors from American ships were taken captive and impressed, as they called it, into the British Navy. So this was a troublesome practice that was supposed to have been outlawed by the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which is what ended the Revolutionary War. Americans had blamed Britain for stirring up Native Americans who were raiding American settlements in the West. Many Americans also had designs on Canada, which was still a British territory. People who wanted war with Great Britain were called war hawks. Among the leaders of the war hawks were Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. They finally persuaded Madison to ask Congress for a declaration of war in 1812. Congress agreed and war was declared. The first battle of the war turned out to be not much of a battle at all. American troops under General William Hull crossed from Fort Detroit into Canada and demanded the surrender of Canadian troops. Even though Hull's forces outnumbered those of the British commander, Isaac Brock, by about 5-1, Hull waited and waited and waited until he became convinced that he was outnumbered. He didn't want his men hurt, so he retreated to Fort Detroit, then surrendered. Not a single shot was fired. Part 4, highs and lows. Well, British luck did not last. During the Battle of York, April 27th, 1813, American forces burned the city of Toronto. A few months later, at Put-in-Bay, Ohio Territory, American ships under Oliver Hazard Perry engaged British ships. The American ships were smaller, but they had more of them. Of the American victory, Perry made his famous statement, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." It was a stunning American victory and gave the U.S. control of the Lake Erie area, which bordered on several vital support sites for the British, places where they can get supplies and men moved around and that sort of thing. On the heels of this victory, another one came. In the Battle of Thames River at Moraviantown in Ontario, Canada, American forces under the command of General William Henry Harrison, who would eventually become president, defeated a combined British Native American force that was retreating from the Lake Erie area after Oliver Hazard Perry's victory there. British troops scored victories in Canada and Upper New York in 1813, and the two sides settled down for a long winter. This time period, winter was a deterrent for fighting in a war. Fighting began anew the next year. Neither side gained much of an advantage until in August, when British forces invaded the streets of Washington, D.C. They burned down the Capitol, the White House building, the War Office, and the Treasury building. Oddly enough, British troops, once they sacked the city, retreated from it soon after. They didn't hold the city. September saw two American victories at Lake Champlain or Plattsburgh and in Baltimore. The Northern victory sealed off British interference in the North, and the Southern victory featured the famous 25-hour shelling of Baltimore's Fort McHenry and also Francis Scott Key's writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. So that's what this illustrates, this painting. Part 5, the final peace and the final battle. Peace talks began in August of 1814 while fighting was still going on. The American victories at Plattsburgh and Baltimore convinced Britain to settle for peace. I want to make a quick point. One of the reasons why they settled for peace was because they were fighting Napoleon, and fighting those two big wars was just too much for anybody, really. On Christmas Eve, 1814, both sides signed a Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war. But the war didn't end. Communication was slow back then. Word of the signing of the peace treaty didn't reach America until weeks after the official last battle of the war had been fought. American troops under Andrew Jackson, who would be future President Jackson, had taken control of Native American possessions in the South and had marched to New Orleans to protect that seaport from British troops. The two sides clashed on January 8, 1815. The Battle of New Orleans ended in an American victory with 2,000 British troops dead compared to only 13 Americans. Treaty of Ghent ended the fighting, but it didn't solve any of the other problems that had driven the two sides to war in the first place. Those would be worked out later. However, the United States had managed to end British influence in what is now continental United States. So please watch this, take your notes, complete your exit ticket, share them with Ms. Marks and I, and then we'll see you tomorrow.